The last 4 weeks we've been working our way through 1 Peter, and Peter develops these themes like salvation, this idea that in Jesus the whole world is being healed. He brings up formation, the idea that as our God is holy, we are to be holy, wholehearted, and set apart for His work. He develops this theme of chosen, this idea that the church community is handpicked by God to be like Jesus. And then he covers this theme of authority, that the way we respect people, including politicians, shows the world a different way. Now, chapter 2, verse 11, really begins this chunk of Scripture, this thought where Peter addresses what it means to put on display a Christian presence in a hostile world. If you work your way through 1 Peter, Peter has this like stream of conscious style writing. It's like your friend who just sends you the longest text message possible. You're like, I need bullet points and a clear delineator of where you're going in this. Peter just has this long stream of consciousness. But it's all summarized by verse 12. He writes, "Live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God." Live such good lives that they may see your good deeds and glorify God. Peter's intention is to promote the Christian reputation in the public square. That those who follow Jesus' example will display God's goodness, beauty, and mercy in the world. And he will explicitly apply this thought in 3 ways: to politics, to enslaved people, and to marriages. Now, one of the risks of working through a book verse by verse is that you come across passages that are, let's call it difficult, to be generous. I mean, we just read a passage that said, "Slaves in reverent fear of God, submit to your masters, and wives, submit to your husbands." And then I, a white husband, step up to explain what this means. Listen, I might be more uncomfortable than you because I've already received texts about this. What do we do when we come across difficult passages? What do we do when we come across something like this in the biblical text that seems incongruent with the rest of God's invitation? Last week, a member of our community texted Cassie about 1 Timothy. They wrote, "What are your views on all the strong statements towards how the church should run, including direction towards women, widows, slaves, worship, etc." They continued, "I know Scripture is Spirit-inspired, but most of the book feels hard for me to swallow or agree with." I asked if I could include this text because if we're honest, we can find ourselves confronted by texts that are hard to swallow. When we come across texts like this, I think it's necessary for us to name that difficulty. To say, I don't get it, and maybe even to go a step further and say, I don't like it. To be honest, to name the questions and difficulties we feel. But let us refuse to stay there. Let us dig deeper into the passages and resist this temptation to ignore our discomfort. Maybe one of the most problematic qualities of American Christianity is the assumption that we know the Bible. But the Bible is a library of ancient writings written over thousands of years in languages we don't speak, in cultures we've never been to, in places we do not live, and in a time very different from our own. It takes effort and work to understand its message, to apply its instructions, and dare I say, appreciate its beauty. If there is anything that I can offer you as your pastor, may it be a commitment to wrestling with the Scriptures. and to working to mine their beauty, that we might be a community that has wrestled with the hard things. So, if you hear nothing else from this sermon, hear this. Commit yourself to study when you come across a difficult passage. Read an article or a commentary. Watch a YouTube video or listen to a podcast. Text a pastor or email a scholar. I promise you, you can probably find the email to most of the major world scholars because they are not doing anything else. They're writing to maybe 15 other scholars, and they will probably respond to you. Take a little bit of time when you come across a difficult passage just to investigate it. This doesn't mean you will be totally happy with the outcome, but your understanding will be far, far richer. I think that when we put in this effort, we will find that even the hard-to-swallow passages are treasure troves of God's creativity and His goodness. And even a text that includes what we might describe as problematic instructions to slaves and wives, it might be hiding some profound riches. Now, this text in particular has some difficulty surrounding it. We must work hard with this passage in particular because it is so offensive. Like, we are Americans, the land of the free and the home of the brave, am I right? We value the freedom to do what we want, and we will protect our rights by any means necessary. I mean, our country started with this disgruntled revolution that threw tea into the Boston Harbor. This text is so offensive because if you or if I were to compose it, it would be a little bit more revolutionary, wouldn't it? Slaves, reject the chains of oppression and defy your masters. Wives, know your worth and leave a toxic husband. Resist and revolt. Amen? Right? So when we think of Peter's instructions to submit, we as Americans think that they sound like an endorsement of the status quo. Many have read Peter as a protector of the status quo and have used this text in particular to justify all manner of evil. Totalitarian governments, enslavement, and misogyny, just to name a few. Many of our friends and family have outright dismissed Christianity on the basis of texts like this. But hear me clearly. Peter is not protecting the status quo. He is offering an alternative vision for changing it. He's writing a subversive manifesto. So to be subversive is this idea of undermining the status quo. The Latin origin is to turn from below. To be subversive is to seek change from the bottom up, from the inside out, in unexpected and surprising ways. Let me be abundantly clear. Peter is not protecting the status quo for authoritarians, cruel masters, or harsh husbands. Just to give you a few examples of him offering the exact opposite advice, in Acts 5, Peter exercises civil disobedience and says, we must obey God rather than human beings. He is not justifying authoritarian reigns. In chapter 2, verse 16, he writes that all believers should, quote, live as free people. Peter is not defending the institution of slavery. In chapter 3, verse 7, Peter writes that men and women are equal inheritors of God's grace. He is not justifying abusive marriages. Remember, Peter's aim is that these exiled believers live such good lives that all would see their good deeds and glorify God. He wants to see change. He wants to see all people come to know God's grace and glory and to reorder society according to God's way. He wants to see change, but in his judgment, he thinks it is best accomplished through subversive stability. This is a subversive stability in which these believers remain committed to their station in life and working for gospel change from the inside out. Authoritarians, cruel masters, and harsh husbands, that they might be won over by suffering love. So here's the plan for today. I want to spend some time unpacking what Peter is up to. And I want to give some insight into his instructions to both slaves and wives, and then we'll spend a few moments reflecting on how we might practice subversive stability. How's that sound? Okay, sweet. I knew it was a hard passage, but let's have a little bit of smiling happening. We can do this together, I promise. Peter is writing what is known as a household code. This is a common and influential instruction for running a household. So philosophers, writers, and intellectuals of the ancient world would often compose household codes because it was one of the more influential writings of the day. Many people would be aware of the household codes. They might even adopt a household code. And so Peter is using this familiar cultural practice to camouflage some more subversive ideas. Ideas that would be simply rejected if spoken plainly. So Peter begins his instructions in a way that would sound like any other household code. He writes, "Everyone submit to the ruling authorities. Slaves submit to masters. Wives submit to their husbands." But in many ways, he uses these common cultural packages to smuggle in the ethics of the gospel. Some of his disruptive ideas are first that he actually addresses slaves and wives. Most household codes were only addressed to the patriarch. And let's be clear, masters subdue your slaves and husbands submit your wives is a very different set of instruction than wives submit to your husbands, slaves submit to your masters. It's subtle, but there is a significant difference. The second embeds agency in the audience to follow through with the instructions. It's not instructions from the top down, but from the bottom up. It's subversive in who he is addressing. The second disruptive inclusion was the idea that these slaves and wives were Jesus followers and their patriarch was not. In the first century, the patriarch of the family and their religious convictions was everybody's religious conviction. So an inclusion like, "Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands so that if any of them do not believe the word, that they might be won over," endows Peter's audience with the dignity of religious choice distinct from their patriarchs. And then the third inclusion that Peter smuggles into his household code is that wives and slaves are not less than their masters or husbands. You missed that part, didn't you? Although these two populations may not have the same cultural standing, economic status, or relational power, they are equal in their standing before God. Remember earlier in chapter 2, verse 16, Peter writes this, "Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves." This was not Peter saying that God is a demanding taskmaster or that he is in the business of divine coercion. This is Peter using the most humble social status possible and applying it to all people. Before God, all people are humble, submissive, and maybe most importantly, equal. And then as he's addressing husbands, more on that in a minute, he writes that men and women are equal inheritors of God's grace. Men and women are equally in need for the redemptive and resurrecting power of Jesus. Again, notice the subtlety of what Peter is smuggling into what seems to be just what everybody else is saying and what everybody else is doing, but he is writing something far more subversive than that. Again, I very much recognize that these statements from Peter do not go far enough for us as 20th century Americans. But for the first 300 years of Christianity's existence, it was a religion made up extensively by the most impoverished and by women. When we look back and say Peter and the other writers of the New Testament should have gone further, we fail to see that they were sowing the seeds of gospel freedom that we now know. It's through God's patient endurance that the world is being redeemed and we are being healed. God could have theoretically changed the whole thing in fire and fury and started over again, and yet God consistently chooses the slow work. He chooses the cross. For if there's anything we know of our God, it is that He is the patient gardener, slowly breaking up the soil of our hardened hearts, carefully planting seeds of hope and glory in our souls, patiently enduring our prodigal ways, gently weeding out the ways of sin and death, and lovingly suffering with us until something new grows. Remember, Peter's aim is for these exiled believers to live such good lives that all would see their deeds and glorify God. Our God is taking the long view. And I think Peter is writing with this long view in mind. So let's jump into his specific instructions. Starting in verse 18, he addresses the enslaved. Peter writes, "Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters. Not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. For it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they are conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and endure it, this is commendable before God." Now, a few things of note. First, I recognize that this text has been used over and over as a justification for slavery, particularly in the American South. But Peter offers no defense of the institution of slavery here. He's actually offering guidance to and recognition of Christians who find themselves enslaved. So any interpretation that suggests Peter is justifying slavery is a poor distortion of this passage. Second, the American practice of slavery and the ancient institution are different. Scott Bartke notes some of the differences between first century slavery and modern slavery. It's first not based on race. Slaves were encouraged to be educated. Many slaves carried out sensitive and highly responsible social functions. Slaves could own property, and the majority of urban and domestic slaves could legitimately anticipate being emancipated by the age of 30. Now, this does not make ancient slavery ethical or morally superior by any measure. It just makes it simply different. And those differences are worth noting. And then third, Peter knew the political and cultural reality well enough to know to not encourage outright rebellion. It's well documented throughout the first century that there had been many slave revolts cruelly and violently ended. And simply Peter didn't want to see the same reality exercised on these new believers. So instead of revolution, Peter encourages these slaves by pointing to the example of Jesus. Paul writes in Philippians 2:7-8, "Jesus made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross." Peter is infusing dignity and sacred purpose into the lives of the enslaved, even when they are unjustly beaten or punished, by insisting that they are following in the way of Jesus. Now, this isn't trite patronizing. It is infusing meaning and purpose into the lives of those who were owned by other human beings. I mean, how many of us have sat across from me or a friend and said, I just want a job that means something. I want to know that I'm making a difference. I want to know that there's a purpose to this hard work. We know the power of purpose and meaning. And for these enslaved believers, Peter is infusing the monotony of their work with significance as he points them to the example of Jesus. He goes further in verse 21. He writes, "To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps." Verse 22, "He committed no sin and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross so that we might die to sin and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were like sheep gone astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and the overseer of your souls." Jesus exemplified one who suffered for doing good. Innocent in every way, yet put to death as a common criminal. But it is through his patient endurance that the world is being redeemed and we are being healed. Through one man's death on a cross, life became possible for many. And Jesus' invitation has always been to follow him into death. Mark 8, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself. Take up his cross and follow me, for whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." This is what scholars refer to as a cruciform interpretation, seeing the way of the cross as the key to understanding life. And as we begin to think about what this might mean, Scott McKnight writes this: "A cruciform understanding of the Christian life is the one thing that is easiest to discern in this passage, though it may be the one item contemporary society resists the most." Peter looks to Jesus' example, who upended the status quo of sin and death by his death and resurrection, and encourages his audience to follow in the same way of suffering love, to stay within the boundaries of their present roles, patiently enduring that they might reveal the glory of God. And then Peter turns his attention to the marriage relationship, addressing wives first and husbands second. Chapter 3, verse 1. "Wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, that they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives, when they see the purity and reverence of your lives." Verse 3, "Your beauty should not come from your outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles and the wearing of gold jewelry or fine clothes. Rather, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is that of great worth in God's sight. For this is the way of the holy women of the past who put their hope in God, used to adorn themselves. They submitted themselves to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her Lord. You are her daughters if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives. Treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers." Now, it may seem problematic that Peter's instructions to wives are 6 times longer than his instructions to husbands. But I think this is likely because Peter recognizes that the wife's position was significantly more challenging and complex than her husband's. If a husband became a Christian, the whole family followed. It was just assumed the husband became a believer, the whole family was now followers of Jesus. If a wife became a Christian, she had to win her husband to the faith. It wasn't assumed. So Peter's 6 verses to wives is not a misogynistic edict, but empathetic guidance on living within the limits of their marriage in a really complex reality, particularly when husbands did not follow Jesus. Peter advises these wives to redouble their efforts to demonstrate God's glory through their love and actions, a way of silently preaching the gospel. He then turns his attention to freeing women from the all too common standards of beauty, luxury, and decadence. Verse 3, your beauty should not come from outward adornment. Verse 4, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit. Now let me kind of spell explicitly out how subversive this is. In a society where the male sexual excess was expected, if not encouraged, I don't think it's too difficult to imagine that the pressure to look a certain way was, let's say, crushing. Now, I know America's the land of healthy beauty standards, but I'm sure we can imagine what that pressure might have been like for these wives. So, consider how refreshing, dare I say, liberating it is for Peter to say, maybe for the first time ever to these women, your beauty does not come from clothes, accessories, or fillers. It comes from a kind and peaceful soul, something that time and age cannot touch. We write this text off as misogyny, but I don't think that could be any further from the truth. This is the last thing, and then I'll pick on husbands. In verse 6, Peter references Sarah. He writes, they submitted themselves to their husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called her Lord. You are her daughters if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. I think you're going to like this bit. There's only one instance of Sarah calling Abram Lord, and it's after she laughed at him. Genesis 18:12, Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, after I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure of having children? Sarah was not a meek, docile bride. Sarah was a feisty older woman with a petty streak. So I'm not really sure why Peter chooses Sarah as his example of a submissive wife, but I think it might be a wink, wink, nod, nod, nudge, nudge. I don't think he is imagining male dominance when he mentions Sarah's example. Last verse, verse 7. Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives, and treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you in the gracious gift of life, so nothing will hinder your prayers. Again, Peter is using a cultural axiom, women are the weaker partner, to smuggle in maybe his most subversive idea. And it's all contained in 4 little words, in the same way. In 4 words, Peter reversed whatever patriarchal rule was imposed by applying everything spoken to the wife to the husband. In the same way is not a little just throwaway phrase. It is applying everything that came before to the husband. Peter was calling for a new type of marriage, not built on convenience or domination, but on mutual submission and mutual consideration. He was insisting on mutual love. And I think this is his most subversive suggestion yet, because marriages built on mutual love do not need household codes. They don't need someone to remind them to submit or to obey or to be respectful. Marriages built on mutual love look towards the interests of the other by embracing humble partnership. This is a gospel idea that was unimaginable 2,000 years ago, and yet today we would say this is ideal. This reality came about because the gospel of Jesus got a hold of men and women who slowly, gradually, and patiently allowed themselves and their ideas to be changed by God. And generation after generation, God did the work. Always keep in mind the nature of our God. He is the patient gardener who uses someone like Peter to plant seeds for the future. Listen, it was through Christians willing to suffer and put their life on the line that God's patient abolition was accomplished. It was by faithful men and women working together to elevate women and curb domestic abuse that we live in the most prosperous time in human history for women. It's through Christ honoring marriages, respect and mutuality and partnership that these things become the ideal marriage dynamic. Listen, I am well aware that there has been so much evil that has masqueraded as Christianity throughout the centuries. But I also know that so much of what we value, justice and freedom, so much of what we enjoy today is a direct result from the gospel of Jesus taking root in the lives of human beings and then working it out in society and culture. So I guess my simple point is this, that God is in the patient work. He's in the slow work of cultivating human souls in such a way that life can be better for all. Worship team, would you return and join me? I want to return to a phrase I introduced at the beginning. Subversive stability. To this day, Benedictine monks take a vow of stability. They commit to living in a particular place with a specific community for life. Saint Benedict himself wrote this: "The workshop where we are to toil faithfully at all these tasks is the enclosure of the monastery and stability in the community." The idea is that the areas of the monastery, combined with a commitment to a particular community, becomes the workshop of a life dedicated to God. The Christian practice of stability is a commitment to staying put and can be applied to being rooted in a relationship, in a community, in a workplace, in friendship, or a specific location. Listen, I know how easy it is for us to plan our escape routes. Work gets a little bit tough and we polish up our resume. The relationship gets a little stale and we begin to wonder if our life would be better with that other person. Things get a little dicey in the neighborhood we moved into or the city we find ourselves in, so we keep our Zillow search up to date. The temptation is to constantly believe the grass is greener. But the practice of stability asks us to remain rooted instead of running when suffering comes. It's an invitation to dig deeper. And I think Peter's little invitation to the enslaved and to wives is to stay settled and dig deeper, to seek change from below, that we might live such good lives that they might see your good deeds and glorify God. To be clear, this is not a guilt trip for anyone who's looking for a different job right now or is thinking about making a move. This is simply a challenge to our restlessness, to see staying as an opportunity to bring change. This will take a holy imagination and the nerve to suffer well. But oh, what could God do through a people of subversive stability that commit themselves to staying put and seeking change through humble submission and suffering love? I end with an excerpt from Eugene Peterson. He writes, "If we can develop a sense that sacrificial love, justice, and hope are at the core of our identities, they go to jobs with us each day and to our families each night, then we are in fact subversive." You have to understand that Christian subversion is nothing flashy. Subversives don't win battles. All they do is prepare the ground and change the mood just a little bit toward belief and hope, so that when Christ appears, these people are waiting for him.